Now I assume that you have read the story and are prepared to discuss the story in Greek. I would like you to take advantage of the first hearing of each question by listening to the question and then pressing pause, taking time to understand what I'm saying. If you need some more help, press play and continue. You'll hear me read it again and see the text. Then press pause again and try to develop your own answer in Greek. Then press play and hear my answer, and you'll hear it twice. The second time you'll see how I composed it in written form. Puo dikeopolis isagi tus vus. Puo dikeopolis isagi tus vus. O dikeopolis isagi tus vus is ton agron. O dikeopolis isagi tus vus is ton agron. Prostis vlepi is ton agron. Prostis vlepi is ton agron. O dikeopolis vlepi pros ton xanthian. O dikeopolis vlepi pros ton xanthian. Ar vlepi ton xanthian is ton agron? Ar vlepi ton xanthian is ton agron? O dikeopolis u vlepi ton dhulon? O dikeopolis u vlepi ton dhulon? Tiu vlepi ton xanthian? Tiu vlepi ton xanthian? Ogar xanthia su paristin in to agro. Ogar xanthia su paristin in to agro. Tiu paristin o doulos. Tiu paristin o doulos. Vradeos gar pros ton agron veni. Vradeos gar pros ton agron veni. Arde un o dikeopolis pui. Arde un o dikeopolis pui. Kaliton dhulon kelei spevde. Kaliton dhulon kelei spevde. Ti deo xanthias lei. Ti deo xanthias lei. Ede spevde o despota. Ede spevde o despota. Ar spevdi pros ton agron? Ar spevdi pros ton agron? Vradeos de veni pros ton agron. Vradeos de veni pros ton agron. Ti feri pros ton agron. Ti feri pros ton agron. Oxanthias feri ton arotron pros ton agron. Oxanthias feri ton arotron pros ton agron. A repita o dikeopolis vlepi pros ton xanthian? A repita o dikeopolis vlepi pros ton xanthian? Ne, vlepi pros ton xanthian, al u vlepi afton. Ne, vlepi pros ton xanthian, al u vlepi afton. Puestin o xanthias. Puestin o xanthias. Kathevdi u poto dendro. Kathevdi u poto dendro. Ar the o dikeopolis heri? Ar the o dikeopolis heri? Kaliafton. Kaliafton. O te paristin ar o doulos elavni tus vus? O te paristin ar o doulos elavni tus vus? O de doulos to sperma lavani ke akoluthi to despote. O de doulos to sperma lavani ke akoluthi to despote. Tis kaliten Demetra. Tis kaliten Demetra. O dikeopolis kali Demetra. O dikeopolis kali Demetra. Tis alavni tus vus. Tis alavni tus vus. O dikeopolis alavni tus vus. O dikeopolis alavni tus vus. Pos alavni tus vus. Pos alavni tus vus. Lavani ton gendron ke kendi tus vus. Lavani ton gendron ke kendi tus vus. In addition to the story, this chapter has a number of sections. word building, grammar, odoulos, classical Greek, and New Testament Greek. The goal of this section is to identify how to use parts of Greek words so that you don't have to learn as much vocabulary. If you can understand how Greek words are formed, then you can deduce their meaning from their parts. Let's take a look at these prepositions. All of these prepositions may be used as prepositional prefixes attaching to the beginning of verb roots. They have no effect on the verb spelling. If they are used as independent prepositions, they must be followed by objects, and they require certain cases, and I give that case information to you here. Is means into. If it's used independently, it must be followed by an object in the accusative case. Ek means out of, and if it's used independently, it must be followed by a genitive object. En means in, and if it's not attached to the beginning of a verb, then it needs a dative object. Pros means to or toward, and again, if it's not attached to the beginning of a verb, then it needs an object, in this case, an accusative object. Let's try these prepositions out on the exercises on page 19 in your textbook. Number 1, prosferi. You know the verb feri, he carries. Pros is to or toward, so he or she carries to or toward. Number 2, ekferi. Again, you know the verb root, feri, he carries. Now the prepositional prefix, ek, out of, so he or she carries out. Number 3, proselavni. You know the verb root, alavni, he drives. With pros in front of it, he or she drives toward. Number 4, prosveni. You know the verb root, veni, to go. Pros is to or toward, so he or she goes or steps toward, or he or she approaches. Number 5, ekali. You know the verb kali, he calls, and ek is out, so he or she calls out. Number 6, isalavni. You know the verb root, alavni, he drives, so isalavni, he or she drives in. I think you get the idea of how useful knowing your prepositional prefixes can be for increasing your verb vocabulary. Let's move on to the next section, which is grammar. First, we're going to look at cases. In this chart, we have 3 columns under masculine and 3 columns under neuter. Some words that we have learned so far are masculine, not that they are male, but they are just categorized as masculine. There are many words that are actually male, like the word for man, that are masculine, but then there are many words that are more feminine that would fall into this category. The same goes for neuter. There are going to be many things that aren't necessarily neuter, like child. Teknon is going to be in the neuter category, but these categories of grammatical gender merely refer to how words are spelled, specifically what types of endings they have. Notice that the masculine nominative forms have os, except for the article, o, kalos, agros, whereas the neuter nominative forms, except for the article, have on endings, kalon, dendron. Another trait of the neuters is that all neuter nominatives are the same as their accusatives. So look at the accusatives in the neuter column, to, kalon, dendron. It is the same as the nominative. The masculine accusative form happens also to be on, but it differs from its nominative. The nominative o, kalos, agros, and the accusative in the masculine column, ton, kalon, agron. Now, if you just saw kalon, agron and didn't know your vocabulary, you wouldn't know whether it was masculine or neuter. But thankfully, the article, the word the, will tell us. Notice the masculine accusative article, ton, matches perfectly the masculine adjective and noun endings, on. Whereas all neuter adjectives and pronouns in their nominative and accusatives don't match their adjective and noun forms. They don't have that final nu. Notice again the neuter nominative, to, kalon, dendron, and the accusative, to, kalon, dendron. The only other place in this chart where the article doesn't match the adjective and noun form is the masculine nominative singular article, o. Notice that it doesn't have a toph or an accent like the other articles. It is a proclitic and has a rough breather. All of the other articles have tophs and accents. The vocative form at the bottom, O, is not an article. It's an interjection, where you're calling out to something. O kale agre, O good field. I guess similar to the famous Latin quote, O fortune. I hope that you've noticed that I've only focused on the nominative and accusative forms on this chart. That is because not all cases are equal. The nominative and accusative case forms are the most important case forms, and the ones that the book has been focusing on up to this point, and the ones that you must simply be able to recognize without even thinking about it. So the book will continue to focus on these two cases for another chapter or so before they start pouring on uses of the genitive and dative. But again, the most important cases for you to learn at this point are the nominative and accusative. The nominative will tell you what your subject is, or in cases where you have a linking verb, the nominative will be your subject and your predicate. And then your accusative will be used for your direct object and also the object of a number of prepositions like is or pros. One thing to notice on this chart is that the nominative and accusative forms all have omicron. The genitive and dative forms have a longer version of that vowel. The genitives have u, which is the digraph long form of omicron, and the datives have omega, which is the single letter long form of omicron. Also notice that the datives always have an iota, in this case an iota subscript. And this is going to be true for all dative forms in every gender and every declension. You must be able to compose this chart quickly from memory before going on to the next chapter. When you write the chart out, write the entire masculine column out first and then the entire neuter column out. Don't just write your articles, o, to, to, tone. Write the entire phrase, the good field, out. O kalos agros, tu kalu agru, to kalo agro, ton kalon agron, o kale agre. I've already mentioned nominative and accusative case uses, but let's review all of the case uses one more time. The nominative case is used to designate the subject or a complement, a predicate. The accusative is the case for the direct object or the object of certain prepositions. The genitive denotes possession and often is translated with our preposition of. It is also used as an object case following certain prepositions like ek. The dative up to this point has followed prepositions showing place. Often we will translate the dative case in English with to or for when it's not following a Greek preposition. And the vocative is for direct address. Section 6 in this chapter deals with the persistent accent of nouns and adjectives. I like to think of it as the persistent accent of non-verbs. This is followed by 2 review exercise sections and then picks up again in point 7 with the recessive accent of verbs. This chart summarizes the various possibilities for accenting non-verbs with short ultimas. Some non-verbs are born with an accent on their antepenult, like anthropos. Some are born with an accent on their penult, like dendron. And some are born with an accent on their ultima, like kalos. And there are some that are born with a circumflex on their penult, like dhulon. The one thing all of these words have in common is a short ultima. This allows for the greatest flexibility for all of the accent marks. Acute may be placed over the antepenult, penult, or ultima, and circumflex may be placed over the penult. You simply have to memorize the accent type and placement for each word as part of the vocabulary memory when you learn a new word. As we have seen from our case chart, though, there are some cases, namely the genitive and dative, that have long ultimas, and this may impact the accenting of a word. Words that had their accent on their antepenult now have to adjust by moving their accent one position toward the end to the penult, anthropu. Next we have words that were born with an acute over their penult. They may have a short ultima or a long ultima. An acute on the penult works either way. So dendron, when we change the ending to dendru, doesn't have to change anything. So far we have learned the second declension for nouns and adjectives. The second declension have words that end in omicron sigma in the nominative or omicron nu for neuters. All of these words that were accented on their ultima with an acute will change to a circumflex for their genitive and dative cases. This is not to say that acutes only go over short ultimas and circumflexes only go over long ultimas. We would see exceptions to that rule. Instead, our rule for words accented on their final syllable will be that they have acutes in the nominative and accusatives and circumflexes in the genitives and datives. Our last possibility is Zulu. It originally had a circumflex on its penult, but when the ultima changes to a long form, circumflex can no longer be placed over the penult. But since acute may be placed over the penult, the accent type changes to an acute. This may seem like a lot of rules initially, but really there are three general principles. Words that have their accent stretched to their furthest position, that is, acute on the antepenult or circumflex on the penult, when their ultimas change to a long form, their accents must change. Acute slides to the penult, and circumflex changes to an acute on the penult. Our second category would be words accented on their penult. For them, nothing happens when their ultima changes to a long form. And our last category are words accented on their ultima, and we have a general pattern of acute being placed over the nominative and accusative forms, and circumflex over the genitive and dative. Let's take a look at this pattern for words accented on their ultima. I call it the box pattern. The genitive and dative have circumflexes as an internal box, and the nominative and accusative have acutes. This will be true for their plural forms as well. Let's go on to exercise 2 delta. We are supposed to give the correct form of the article to complete the following phrases. Be careful with the accents. Before we can be careful with the accents, we have to identify which pattern the article will follow. The article has only one syllable, which means that it has its accent on its ultima. Thus, we would expect the nominative and accusative to have acutes, and the genitive and dative to have circumflexes. Of course, those acutes will change to grave if followed by another word. The exception to this is the nominative article. O is a proclitic and doesn't have an accent of its own. So the first form, Zulon, we have to decide, is that a neuter word or is that a masculine word? We've learned this word as odhulos, so we know it's masculine. So the answer is ton zulon with a grave. Number 2, in blank agro, there's only one form with an omega. That's to with a iota subscript and a circumflex. Number 3, anthropos. The os ending should be immediately apparent to us as nominative because we've learned our nominatives and accusatives so well. So our nominative article is o, no accent, but a rough breather. Ek is always followed by a genitive, and uku has a genitive ending as well, so our genitive is tu with a circumflex. Arothron. We've learned that one as a neuter word. To arothron. Remember that neuter pronouns and articles don't have a nu at their end. Upo blank dendro, a dative, I can tell by the iota subscript. All datives have iotas. So the article will match to with a iota subscript and circumflex. And number 7 will be the same form in to, omega with iota subscript and circumflex, uko. Exercise 2 epsilon. We're to complete the following sentences by giving the correct endings to the verbs, nouns, and adjectives, and then translate the sentences into English. Number 1. Odhulos spev blank proston blank. Okay, let's first identify the subject. We can tell that by the article and os ending, odhulos. That is a third person. Currently, we only know singulars, so our only singular other persons would be ego, I, and su, you. So I have a feeling all of our verbs are going to have third-person endings. Odhulos spevdi, proston, and you got it, pros needs an accusative. We can tell the article is going to match it. Proston agron. Number 2. Ozikiopolis ton arg blank, dhulon kal blank. It looks like we have an article, adjective, noun sequence here. Ton arg blank, dhulon. So the arg ending will match dhulon as well as the article. That would give us ton argon doulon, the lazy servant. And we're left with kal. That could have been an adjective, but we still need a verb, so let's make it a verb ending. Kali. O Dikeopolis ton argon doulon kali. Dikeopolis calls the lazy servant. Number 3, we've seen this in context plenty of times. Elthe devro ke sulamvan blank. Well, I guess this is an exception to my expectation that all the verbs were going to be third person. With elthe devro, we are commanding someone, probably the servant, to come here, and we would expect to use the imperative ending on this verb as well. Sulamvane. Number 4, ero alavn blank, tus vus ek tu ag blank. So alavn would be our verb. Ego, there's a first person, so ego alavno tus vus ek tu ag, it's going to match the article, ek tu agru. Number 5, me halapos. We've seen that before, I just had to finish it. Me halapos isti. So don't be so difficult. Oh, do we want to say doulos here? No, we're speaking directly to him. We have the O showing that it's vocative. O doula. Allah pon blank. We are commanding him to do something in correlation to isti. So an imperative ending is in order here. Allah poni. It doesn't end in merely an epsilon because remember this verb, like ukeo, is a contract verb. Poneo. Contracting to pono, ponis, poni. Grammar point number 7, the recessive accent of verbs. Thankfully, the accenting principles for verbs are far easier than those for nouns. In fact, you don't even need to memorize the accent placement when you're learning verb vocabulary. The accent will always be placed as early as possible. So if we have a short ultima, acute can be placed all the way on the antepenult, like in sulamvane. But there are a few times when we won't have enough syllables, like in spevde. Here, according to our rules for acute and circumflex, either one can be placed over the penult with a short ultima. In this situation, we will always choose circumflex. It's the one time when circumflex can appear on the penult, so it would only be fair for us to take it. Now, when we have long ultimas on verbs, which we have seen for our first, second, and third person singular indicative forms, I do something, you do something, he does something, they all have long forms, o, is, e. The acute may only be placed as early as the penult. Thus we have sulamvano, spevdo. We have no question about acute or circumflex on spevdo here, since with a long ultima, circumflex can't be placed that early. And with contract verbs, our original accent would have likewise been on the penult, pone, but when the root contracted with the stem and endings to form poni, we wanted to keep the accent over that same syllable location, and we mark that with a circumflex. So contract verbs will be the one apparent exception to our accenting rules for verbs, but really it's following the same principles that we are using for all other verbs. Exercise 2 Zeta. Translate the following pairs of sentences. Number 1. O doulos eugestin Athenaeos. This is a pretty simple sentence. We have a subject, o doulos, our verb, an adverb, eugestin, is not, and an adjective complement, Athenaeos. The slave is not an Athenian. Notice the accenting on eugestin. That's our exception to accenting imi. When it follows uk in the third person, it has an acute on its penult. Let's try a similar sentence, moving from English to Greek. We have a subject, verb, linking verb, and complement. Xanthias is not strong. So we would have o xanthias as our subject, eugestin, and we will have the same accent as above. Our complement will be in the nominative to match o xanthias, ischioros. Number 2. O Dikeopolis ekveni ek tu ke kali ton doulon. This sentence is a little more complex. We have two clauses. We have two verbs, ekveni, connected by ke kali. And in the first clause, O Dikeopolis, we have our subject. We have an intransitive verb, ekveni, he goes, and then a prepositional phrase, ek tu. Now our second clause is connected by ke, and he kali, there's our verb, he calls ton dulon. Our composition sentence is equally complex. We have two clauses. The first has an intransitive verb with a prepositional phrase. The slave hurries to the field. And our second has a transitive verb with an object and carries the plow. So the same structure. O doulos, so there's our nominative. Spevdi, so he hastens. Our prepositional phrase, pros ton agron. Keferi ton arotron. Nothing strange accenting here. All our final acutes have changed to grav when they're followed by another word, and that's about it as far as accenting goes. Number 3. O doulos ou sulamvani, ala kathevdi upo to dendro. Some interesting things here. Well, first let's look at the structure. We have a subject, o doulos. We have our verb, ou sulamvani, and that is an intransitive verb. It doesn't require an object. And then we have a conjunction, ala, but, and then our next clause, kathevdi, another intransitive verb, followed by a prepositional phrase. Where does he sleep? Upo to dendro. And there's our dative following upo, showing place where. As far as accenting goes, dendro keeps its acute on its penult. That's where it was born, and that's where it can stay, whether it has a long ultima or a short ultima. To, its article has a circumflex because it follows our box pattern for words accented on their ultima in their genitive and dative forms having circumflex. We have a similar English sentence with a subject, an intransitive verb, conjunction, another intransitive verb, and prepositional phrase showing place where. The man, o anthropos, our nominative, uk estin. Remember, estin gets an accent on its penult when it follows uk. Ala vadizi, there's our next verb. Pros ton eukon. Here our preposition pros requires an accusative. So ton does not have a circumflex. It has a grav because it's followed by another word. And eukon keeps its circumflex where it was born. Number 4. Iseltha is ton eukon oxantia keferi ton siton. This sentence has imperatives. We have an intransitive verb, iseltha, enter, and they always like to repeat that preposition, is ton eukon. Come into the house, o xantia. A conjunction, ke, and another command, fere ton siton. This verb takes an object, ton siton. Our English sentence has the same structure. We have an imperative, intransitive imperative, come, a vocative, slave. We have a conjunction, and then a transitive imperative, lead the oxen in, lead in the oxen. So the Greek would be elthe, o doula. Elthe has a strange accent. We just have to memorize that it has an acute on its ultima, and that is a violation, I guess, of our verb accenting rules. Elthe, o doula, there's our vocative ending. Ke isaia, and that takes an accusative object. Tus vus. Number 5. Me poni oxantia ala elthedevro. Getting more complex, I know that poni is an imperative because it's negated by me rather than u. Also, I note that the accent is on its penult, which originally would have been its antepenult. The indicative form of work would be poni. Here, poni is the imperative. So, don't work. It's kind of funny that he would be commanding Xanthias to do this. Don't work, O Xanthia. Conjunction, ala, another imperative, elthedevro. Now our composition sentence has the same structure. Don't sleep, so a negated imperative, vocative, man, but a conjunction, another imperative, work, and it's intransitive, in the field. So don't sleep. Me kathevde. Notice the accent moves all the way to the antepenult because our ultima is short, and we have our recessive principle for accenting verbs. O anthrope, our vocative ending, allows anthropa to keep its accent on its antepenult where it was born, anthropos. Ala, poni, there is our imperative that we saw earlier in the Greek sentence, poni, into agro. On to a new story, O doulos. Practice using my recording to train yourself to read it as quickly as I can. Use the pause and play button to allow yourself time to practice each sentence. Once you can read it as quickly as I can, then go on to answer the comprehension questions. O afturgo spevdi iston agoron, ke kali ton dhulon, o dhe dhulos u parestin, kathevdiga rupo to dendro. O despotes vadisi pros afton ke lei, elsa devro o dhule aria, ke poni. O dhulos vadisi pros afton ke lei, me halaposisti o despota, e degarimi ego, ke ferus u to arotron. O despotes lei, spevdo xantia, mikros mengarestin o agros, makros de oponos. On to the comprehension questions. Number 1. What is the farmer doing? O aftergos spevdi iston agoron ke kali ton dhulon. Number 2. What is the slave doing? O dhulos kathevdi upoto zendro. Number 3. When told to come and help, what does the slave do? O dhulos vadisi pros afton, ke lei, me halaposisti o despota, e degar parimi ego ke ferros u to arotron. Number 4. Why is the slave urged to hurry? Mikros mengarestin o agros, makros de oponos. Exercise 2-eta. This is the section that I consider most important, composition. Make sure that you have at least tried to translate all of these into Greek before continuing. Stop this video now if necessary to do that. It is important that you work through these on your own first before hearing how I would translate them. Number 1. Dikeopolis no longer, and we're to use uketi, works, but loosens the oxen. So our subject is Dikeopolis. O Dikeopolis, uketi, now we just have our intransitive verb, works, poni. Conjunction, Allah, he loosens the oxen. Lui, tous vous. Number 2. And we're told to use the postpositive. Then he calls the slave and says, don't work any longer, and we're to use meketi for no longer with the imperative. But, conjunction, come here and take the plow. We have a number of clauses here. So the first word we're going to translate is then. Epita. We could use un, but since we already have been told to use the as a postpositive, let's use epita. Epita the, he calls, kali, now our object, ton dhulon, ke, lei, now our don't work any longer, meketi poni. This must be an imperative, so we keep the accent on the first syllable, poni, and meketi takes care of our negative. Allah elthe devro. Now conjunction, ke, lamvane, another imperative, take, and we need an object, toarotron. So altogether it is, epite the to dhulon kali, ke lei, meketi poni, Allah elthe devro, ke lamvane toarotron. Number 3, for I, and we're to use the personal pronoun, ego, on the one hand, am driving the oxen to the house, and you, su, on the other hand, use the imperative, carry the plow. Okay, now this sentence is tricky because we have two postpositives. We have for, which will be gar, and we have on the one hand, which is min. The instructions tell us whenever we have two postpositives together with min involved, min will be the first one. So we end up with ego min gar. Now the rest of our sentence, lavno tous vous, or we can talk about, if we're emphasizing the oxen, we could say tous vous pros ton yukon lavno. And then we have you on the other hand, su the fere, there's our imperative, toarotron. So altogether it's egomen gar tous vous pros ton yukon lavno, su the fere arotron. I forgot the article there. Su the fere toarotron. Number 4. So on the one hand, Dikeopolis drives the oxen out of the field, and on the other hand, the slave takes the plow and carries it toward the house. All right, again we have two postpositives. This time we have men and un. So we'll have o men un Dikeopolis, elavni tus vus, ek tu agru. Then we have things on the other hand, o the doulos to arotron lamvani, ke feri prostonukon. Our classical Greek passage comes from Kalimikos. He says, mega vivlion mega kakon. No verb, but we can imply it. Mega vivlion, a great book, is mega kakon, big trouble, I guess. And the New Testament passage comes from Luke 3:22. Sui o iosmu o agapitos. That is actually really difficult to read because of all the vowels. But once you understand what it says, it becomes easier. Sui, you are, o iosmu. Now we have to say that all as one word because o is proclitic, mu is enclitic, both leaning on ios for their accent. My son, you are my son, sui o iosmu o agapitos, the beloved, or my beloved. Well done working through all of these exercises. Make sure that you review all of the stories in the chapter in the workbook and can create and answer questions about them in Greek. Then you're welcome to move on to Chapter 3 Alpha.